The forest whispered warnings. As Nix Whitmore's battered sedan struggled up the mountain road, its engine coughing like a dying man's final breath. Every mile deeper into the Cascade Wilderness brought fresh doubts, but the pull in her chest, that inexplicable magnetic force that had haunted her dreams for months, grew stronger with each passing tree. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather, as shadows danced between the towering pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of green darkness that swallowed her headlights whole. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, leaving her with nothing but a hand-drawn map she'd received from a mysterious woman at a truck stop in Portland. The stranger had approached her table while she nursed cold coffee, pressing the crumpled paper into her palm with eyes that held too much knowledge. "Follow the old logging road past Whisper Creek," the woman had said, her voice carrying an accent Nix couldn't place. "They're waiting for you, child. They just don't know it yet." Now, as her car crested another hill, Nix questioned the sanity of following cryptic directions from a stranger. But the dreams wouldn't let her rest, visions of silver eyes burning with pain, of a man's voice calling her name through howling wind, of hands that shifted between human and claw reaching desperately through darkness. She tried therapy, meditation, even prescription sleep aids, but nothing could quiet the visions that came with increasing intensity. The only relief came from driving north, toward whatever waited in these ancient mountains. The headlights suddenly illuminated a wooden sign, weathered and scarred by decades of mountain storms. "Shadowmere Pack territory trespassers will be prosecuted." Below it, someone had spray-painted in red letters, "Turn back or die." Nix's foot instinctively moved toward the brake. The invisible force in her chest yanked her forward like a fish on a line. Whatever lay ahead, she'd already committed to this path months ago, when the dreams first began. She drove past the sign, her heart hammering against her ribs as the road narrowed to barely more than twin ruts carved through the forest floor. Branches scraped against her windows with sounds like fingernails on glass, and more than once she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shapes too large and too quick to be natural wildlife. The rational part of her mind catalogued these observations with growing alarm, but a deeper part, something primal and ancient that dwelt in the hollow of her bones, recognized the watchers and felt no fear. The road opened into a clearing just as her fuel gauge needle touched empty, as if the universe had timed her arrival with mathematical precision. Before her stretched a compound unlike anything she'd seen in travel magazines or hiking guides, log cabins and modern structures arranged in a careful semicircle around what appeared to be a central lodge, all connected by elevated walkways that disappeared into the tree line like the branches of some massive organism. Solar panels gleamed on several rooftops, and she could see the warm glow of lights in windows, suggesting a thriving community hidden in this mountain sanctuary. But it was the people emerging from buildings and shadows that made her breath catch in her throat. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of predatory awareness, and even in the darkness, she could see their eyes catching and reflecting her headlights like mirrors. Men and women of various ages stepped into the clearing, forming a loose circle around her vehicle, their postures alert and unwelcoming. Children peered from doorways and windows, their small faces serious beyond their years. Nix turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as she studied the faces surrounding her. These weren't ordinary mountain folk living off the grid. There was something else here, something that made the air itself seem to hum with barely contained energy. The dreams had prepared her for strangeness, but reality carried a weight that imagination couldn't match. A woman approached the driver's side, moving with the cautious confidence of someone accustomed to authority. She appeared to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair braided over one shoulder and eyes the colour of storm clouds. When she tapped on the window, her smile held no warmth, only cold calculation. "You're lost," the woman said, as Nix rolled down the window, her voice carrying the tone of someone stating fact rather than asking a question. "This is private property. You need to turn around and head back to the main road." "I don't think I'm lost," Nix replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm looking for the Shadowmere pack." The change in the crowd was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence. Children disappeared from windows, and the circle of watchers tightened almost imperceptibly. The woman's friendly mask slipped entirely, revealing something sharp and dangerous beneath. "And what would a human want with our pack?" The question came from behind her, spoken in a voice that raised every hair on Nix's arms. She turned to see a man emerging from the central lodge, and her breath stopped completely. He was the man from her dreams. Not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly the same down to the scar that bisected his left eyebrow, and the way he carried his shoulders as if bearing an invisible weight. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with dark hair that fell in waves to his collar, and skin bronzed by mountain sun. But it was his eyes that confirmed what she'd already known in her heart silver, like polished mercury, holding depths of pain and responsibility that no human gaze could contain. This was Cade Thornfield, Alpha of the Shadowmere pack, though she'd never learned his name through any earthly means. "You," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. "You're the one who's been calling me." The effect of her words was immediate and catastrophic. Several pack members shifted backward, with sharp intakes of breath, hands moving to weapons she couldn't see but somehow knew were there. The woman beside her car hissed between her teeth, and children's faces reappeared in windows, drawn by the electric tension that now filled the clearing like an approaching storm. Cade himself went perfectly still, those silver eyes narrowing as he studied her with an intensity that felt like standing too close to a bonfire. When he spoke again, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "You're the witch." It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his tone sent ice through her veins. Around the circle, she heard whispered words in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood words for curse and darkness and death. These people believed she was here to harm them, to destroy whatever they'd built in this mountain sanctuary. The weight of their combined hostility pressed against her chest like a physical force. "I'm not a witch," Nix said, climbing out of her car despite the forest of hostile gazes surrounding her. "I'm just someone who's been having dreams about this place, about you." She looked directly at Cade, watching his expression shift from suspicion to something more complex, more troubled. "You've been in pain. Something's eating you from the inside, and you can't stop it." The silence that followed her words was profound and dangerous. She could hear her own heartbeat, could smell pine and wood smoke, and something else, something wild and animalistic that made her palms sweat. Several pack members exchanged glances loaded with meaning, and she caught fragments of whispered conversations that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of comprehension. "Vera warned us she would come," someone said from the crowd, the words carrying clearly in the mountain air. "She said the witch would know things, would use our alpha's suffering against us." "The prophecy spoke of deception," added another voice, this one belonging to a young man whose eyes held gold flecks that caught the light. "She would appear as salvation, but bring only destruction." Cade raised a hand, and the murmuring stopped instantly. His gaze never left Nyx's face as he stepped closer, moving with that same predatory grace she'd noticed in the others. When he was close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his silver eyes, he stopped and tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. "You smell wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not human, but not witch either. Something else entirely. He leaned closer, and she caught his scent pine and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "What are you, Nyx Whitmore?" The sound of her name on his lips sent electricity racing down her spine, though she'd never told him or anyone else in this clearing who she was. The confirmation that their connection went deeper than simple dreams made her knees weak, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet his penetrating gaze. "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty in her voice seemed to surprise him. "I've been having dreams about you for months. Visions of you in pain, calling for help. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself I was losing my mind, but they got stronger. I had to come here. I had to find you." "The moonless prophecy," breathed the older woman, her storm cloud eyes widening with recognition and fear. "After all these years, she's finally come." The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Several pack members actually stepped backward, and Nyx heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn. Children were pulled inside and doors slammed shut, leaving only the adults to face whatever threat she apparently represented. "Dr. Helena Blackwood," Cade said, without turning around, his eyes still locked on Nyx's face. "Remind us of the exact wording." The older woman moved closer, her weathered hands clasped tightly together as she recited words that sounded like they'd been carved into her memory through repetition and fear. "When the Alpha's mind begins to fracture, when madness takes hold of the moon-touched leader, she will come. Neither human nor wolf, neither witch nor heather, that something between all worlds. She will appear as salvation, but bring the pack's destruction, unless the Alpha's strength can overcome the darkness she carries." "But there's more," added a new voice, this one belonging to a young woman with intricate braids and knowing eyes. "The prophecy speaks of two paths: destruction or redemption. The choice belongs to the Alpha, but the power belongs to her." Nyx felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure against her skin. These people had been living with the fear of her arrival for generations, preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of their entire pack. And now she stood before them, a woman who'd followed dreams across half a continent, with no clear understanding of her own nature or purpose. "The madness," she said quietly, looking at Cade with sudden comprehension. "That's what I've been sensing in the dreams. Something's wrong with your mind, isn't it? Something that's getting worse." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head that spoke of reluctant admission. "It started 6 months ago, Flashes of rage I couldn't control. Moments where I couldn't distinguish between memory and reality. The pack physician believes it's connected to an old injury, but her treatments only slow the progression. It's going to kill you, Nick said, the words coming from that same deep knowledge that had guided her here. And when it does, it'll take the pack with you. That's why I'm here. Not to destroy, but to help. The prophecy warns against trusting her words, Dr. Blackwood interjected, her voice sharp with medical authority and maternal protectiveness. Cade, we've discussed this extensively. The risk is too great. But what if she's right? The question came from the young man with gold-flecked eyes, his voice carrying the weight of desperate hope. What if the prophecy has been misinterpreted all these years? What if she's not the destruction, but the cure? Cade's silver gaze shifted between his pack members, weighing their words against whatever internal compass guided his decisions. When he looked back at Nyx, she saw something new in his expression, not trust, but a willingness to consider possibilities beyond fear. You said you've been dreaming about me, he said. What exactly have you seen? The question opened floodgates in her memory, releasing images and sensations that had tormented her sleep for months. She closed her eyes, letting the visions flow through her consciousness like a river of liquid mercury, carrying pain and desperation and an overwhelming need for connection. I see you in a cabin, alone, fighting something invisible, she began, her voice growing stronger as the images crystallized. Your hands shift between human and claws, and you can't control the change. There's blood own blood on the walls and floor. You're trying to call out, but the words come out as growls and howls. You're losing yourself piece by piece, and you know it. Several pack members exchanged startled glances, and she heard Dr. Blackwood's sharp intake of breath. Whatever she was describing, it matched their own observations too closely to be coincidence or lucky guessing. In Sundreams, I see you as a wolf, she continued, opening her eyes to meet his increasingly intense stare. But not a normal wolf, something larger, more powerful, with silver fur that seems to glow in moonlight. But even in that form, there's pain. Something foreign in your system, like poison or infection, spreading through your mind and body. The silver poisoning, whispered the young woman with braids. It has to be. The symptoms match perfectly. Nyx felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in her mind, though she still couldn't see the complete picture. Silver poisoning? But silver is supposed to harm werewolves, not help them. Not all silver, Cade said, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. Some varieties, when introduced properly into a werewolf system, can enhance certain abilities, but it requires precise dosing and specific conditions. Too much, or the wrong kind, and it becomes a slow-acting poison that attacks the nervous system and mind. Someone poisoned you deliberately, she said, the certainty hitting her like a physical blow. This isn't an accident or old injury. Someone wanted to destroy you and your pack, but they needed it to look natural. They needed you to slowly lose your mind so the pack would fracture from within. The clearing erupted in voices as pack members absorbed the implications of her words. Accusations flew about enemies and traitors, about old wounds and recent threats. But Cade remained silent, his silver eyes studying Nyx with an intensity that made her skin tingle with electricity. "Even if you're right about the cause," Dr. Blackwood said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "that doesn't explain how you could help. Silver poisoning in werewolves is irreversible. Once it binds to the nervous system, there's no known cure." "No known cure," Nyx agreed, taking a step closer to Cade, despite the weapons trained on her from every direction. "But I'm not exactly known, am I? I don't fit any of your categories. Not human, not witch, not werewolf. Maybe that's the point. Maybe I'm something that exists outside your normal rules." "Or maybe you're the one who poisoned him in the first place," said a new voice from the crowd, this one carrying deadly suspicion. "Maybe this is all an elaborate ruse to finish what you started." The accusation hit Nyx like a slap, and she felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. These people were so focused on their prophecy and their fears that they couldn't see past their own assumptions, but as frustration built in her chest, something else began to rise with Itea warmth that started in her core and spread outward like sunlight through her veins. "I understand your caution," she said, her voice carrying new authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. "But while you waste time on accusations and debates, your alpha is dying. I can feel the poison in him from Harriet, tastes like copper and despair, and it's spreading faster than you realize." Cade's eyes widened at her words, and she saw him take an involuntary step backward. "You can sense it?" "Specifically?" "I can taste it," she said, the admission feeling strange on her tongue. "Like metal fillings in my mouth, but wrong. Corrupted. And I can feel your pain, as if it were my own." She looked around the circle of hostile faces, her patience finally reaching its limit. "So, you have a choice. You can keep treating me like a threat while your leader slowly loses his mind, or you can let me try to help him. But decide quickly, because I don't think he has much time left." The silence that followed was heavy with tension and unspoken communication. Pack members exchanged glances loaded with meaning, having entire conversations through subtle gestures and expressions. Finally, the young man with gold-flecked eyes stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority. "My name is Marcus Webb, and I serve as the Pack's beta," he said, offering her a slight nod that might have been respect. "The decision belongs to our alpha, but I believe we should at least hear what you're proposing." "Marcus," Dr. Blackwood warned, her storm cloud eyes flashing with disapproval. "No, Helena," Cade said, his voice cutting through the discussion with quiet finality. "He's right. We're running out of options, and conventional treatments have failed. If there's even a chance she can help." He trailed off, his silver gaze meeting Nyx's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What would you need to do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Nyx realized she was standing at a crossroads that would determine not only her own fate, but the future of everyone in this mountain clearing. The warmth in her chest pulsed stronger, and with it came knowledge she couldn't explain, understanding of processes and connections that existed beyond normal human comprehension. "I need to touch you," she said simply. "Skin to skin contact. The poison has to be drawn out, and I think I can do that. But it requires physical connection to work." The Pack's reaction was immediate and predictable. Weapons appeared from concealment, voices rose in protest, and she found herself surrounded by a circle of protection that had nothing to do with protecting her. These people would die before they let a potential threat make physical contact with their alpha, prophesy or no prophecy. Absolutely not, Dr. Blackwood said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her medical opinions respected without question. We know nothing about her true nature or capabilities. Physical contact could accelerate the poisoning or transfer some unknown contamination to Cade. The risk is unacceptable. The risk of doing nothing is death, Nix countered, frustration bleeding into her tone. I can feel the poison spreading through his system like acid. You have days, maybe hours, before he loses control completely. And when that happens, how many pack members will die before you're forced to put him down like a rabid animal? Her words hit their target with devastating accuracy. She saw the truth of her prediction in their faces, watched pack members struggle with the knowledge they'd been avoiding. Their alpha was dying, and when he finally succumbed to the madness, he would become a threat to everyone he'd sworn to protect. There might be another way to test her intentions, Marcus said quietly, his gold-flecked eyes thoughtful. The pack bond. If she can sense Cade's conditions so clearly, she might be able to prove her purpose through the connection itself. What pack bond? Nix asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt understanding dawn in her consciousness. These people weren't just a community or even a family. They were connected on a level that transcended normal human relationships. Pack members share emotional and sometimes physical sensations through a psychic connection centered on the alpha. Dr. Blackwood explained, her voice clinical despite the extraordinary nature of what she was describing. It's how we maintain unity and coordination, especially during times of crisis. But accessing the bond requires specific conditions and considerable trust. Or, Cade said slowly, his silver eyes never leaving Nix's face. It requires the kind of natural connection that might exist between an alpha and someone meant to heal him. The suggestion sent electricity through the clearing, and Nix felt the collective breath of 30 people held in anticipation. Whatever they were proposing went far beyond simple trust. It was an invitation into the most intimate aspect of pack life, a connection that could reveal everything about her true nature and intentions. If you're willing, Marcus continued, we could attempt a limited bond connection. Just enough to verify your ability to sense Cade's condition and your motivation for being here. If you're truly here to help, the bond will confirm it. If you're here to cause harm, he let the implication hang unfinished, but she could fill in the blanks easily enough. And if the connection proves she's telling the truth? Cade asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Then we let her try, Marcus said simply. The prophecy speaks of choice and redemption as well as destruction. Perhaps it's time we focused on the possibility of salvation rather than the certainty of doom. Nix looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear and hope warring in equal measure. These people had lived with the weight of prophecy for generations, preparing for a confrontation that might destroy everything they'd built. But they were also pragmatists, survivors who'd carved out a life in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. When faced with certain death or uncertain hope, they were willing to choose hope. What do I need to do? She asked, her voice steady, despite the racing of her heart. Cade stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin and catch the complex scent that marked him as something more than human. When he extended his hand, palm up, she saw the faint lines of old scars crisscrossing his skin like a roadmap of violence survived. "Place your palm against mine," he instructed, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The bond connection requires skin contact and conscious intent from both parties. If you're truly here to help, the pack will know it immediately. She looked down at his outstretched hand, noting the size and strength of it, the careful steadiness that spoke of absolute control over supernatural power. This was her moment of choice trust in the visions that had driven her. Across a continent, or retreat to the safety of ignorance, a normal human existence. Without hesitation, she placed her palm against his. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Electric current raced up her arm and exploded through her nervous system, carrying with it sensations and emotions that weren't her own. She felt the pack's collective presence like a warm embrace. Dozens of minds and hearts connected through bonds of loyalty and shared purpose. But beneath that comforting network ran currents of pain and corruption that made her gasp with their intensity. The silver poisoning revealed itself in full detail, not just physical contamination, but a deliberate infection designed to destroy the supernatural connections that made pack life possible. Someone had crafted this poison specifically to attack the alpha bond, knowing that its destruction would leave the pack vulnerable and directionless. But worse than the poison itself was its source. Through the connection, Nyx saw flashes of memory that made her blood run cold. A trusted pack member administering medicine to their alpha, small doses over months that accumulated into this slowly spreading destruction. The betrayal ran deeper than simple murder. It was an attack on the very foundations of their society. "Dr. Blackwood," she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. Through the bond, she felt Cade's shock and the pack's collective horror as her accusation hit home. "She's been poisoning you, not to heal, but to destroy the pack from within." The clearing erupted in chaos as pack members processed the implications of her words. But Helena Blackwood herself stood frozen, her storm-cloud eyes wide with the panic of exposure. For a heartbeat, her mask of medical authority slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Impossible," Marcus breathed, but his gold-flecked eyes were already tracking the subtle changes in Helena's posture and expression. As Beta, his job was to read people, to identify threats before they could materialize. And now, with Nyx's accusation hanging in the air, he was seeing signs he'd missed or dismissed over the months of Cade's deterioration. "She's been treating me for 6 months, Cade said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of an alpha confronted with betrayal. "Helena has been part of this pack for over 20 years. She delivered half the children here, treated injuries, saved lives, and now she's trying to destroy everything she helped build," Nyx said, her palm still pressed against his as information continued to flow between them. "I can see her memories through your connection to her. She's been recruited by someone outside the pack, someone who wants the Shadowmere territory for themselves." Helena's facade cracked completely, and her hand moved with practiced efficiency toward a weapon concealed beneath her jacket. But the movement was anticipated by a dozen pack members whose supernatural reflexes made human speed look like slow motion. She found herself surrounded by a forest of weapons, held perfectly still by people who'd trusted her with their lives for decades. "Why?" Cade asked, the single word carrying more pain than anger. Helena, you were pack. You were family. Why would you betray us like this? Because you're all living in the past, she snarled, her mask of kindness disappearing entirely, hiding in these mountains, pretending the modern world doesn't exist. There are developers who would pay millions for this territory, corporations who could use your unique abilities for purposes that actually matter. But you cling to your old ways, your primitive social structures, while the world passes you by. So you decided to murder your alpha and destroy the pack, Marcus said, his voice carrying deadly calm. How very modern of you. I didn't want to kill him, Helena protested, though her words held no remorse. The poison was designed to make him step down, to fragment the pack enough that they'd be willing to consider other options. But he's too stubborn to quit, too proud to admit weakness. So yes, eventually it would have killed him. The admission sent ripples of fury through the pack bond, and Nyx felt their collective rage like a physical force. These people had lived with the fear of watching their leader slowly go insane, had prepared themselves for the possibility of having to end his life to protect the community, all while the person they trusted to heal him was systematically destroying him from within. But as the pack's anger built to dangerous levels, Nyx felt something else. Through the connection different kind of energy that seemed to respond to their emotional intensity. The warmth in her chest pulsed stronger, spreading through her body like liquid sunlight, and with it came understanding of her own nature that hit her like revelation. I can fix this, she said, her voice cutting through the pack's furious voices with startling clarity. The poison, the damage to the Alpha Bondi can heal all of it, but I need everyone to step back and let me work. How? Cade asked, though his silver eyes suggested he was beginning to understand something about her nature that even she was only now recognizing. Because I'm not just between worlds, she said, pieces of genetic memory and inherited knowledge finally clicking into place. I'm a bridge between them. My ancestors were healers who worked specifically with supernatural communities, people who existed at the intersection of human and otherworldly societies. We were guardians of the connections that hold packs together. The moon touched, breathed one of the older pack members, recognition dawning in his weathered features. The old stories spoke of healers who could repair bonds thought permanently severed, but they disappeared generations ago. Not disappeared, Nyx corrected, her understanding deepening with each passing moment. Hidden, integrated into human society until the need arose again. My family scattered after the last great persecution, but we carried the genetic memory, the inherited abilities. We just forgot how to access them. Until now, Cade said, his voice carrying wonder and cautious hope. The dreams were your call, reaching across genetic memory, finding someone capable of answering, she continued, her palm still pressed against his as power built between them. The poison triggered your instinctive search for a healer, and my inherited abilities responded. Through the pack bond, she felt their collective amazement and growing hope. But there was also fear these people had lived with the weight of prophecy for so long that the possibility of salvation seemed almost too dangerous to believe. The prophecy spoke of destruction, Dr. Blackwood said, her voice carrying defiant bitterness even surrounded by weapons. She may be able to heal the poison, but the ancient words warned against trusting her. No, said the young woman with braids, her eyes bright with sudden understanding. We interpreted the prophecy wrong. She will appear as salvation, but bring the pack's destruction. We assumed that meant she would pretend to help, while actually causing harm. But what if it means the opposite? What if she brings salvation that appears destructive to those who profit from the current suffering? The revelation hit the pack like a thunderbolt, reframing everything they'd believed about the ancient prophecy. Helena Blackwood had been profiting from Cade's slow poisoning, using his deterioration to position herself as indispensable while secretly working to destroy the pack from within. From her perspective, a true Hina would indeed bring destruction, the destruction of her plans and her power. The choice spoken of in the prophecy, Marcus said slowly, wasn't Kate's choice whether to trust her. It was Helena's choice whether to reveal her true nature when faced with genuine healing. And she chose betrayal, Cade said, his silver eyes hard as winter steel. Which means the prophecy has been fulfilled, just not in the way we expected. Nyx felt the pack's mood shift from fear to determination, their collective will aligning around the possibility of redemption rather than the certainty of destruction. Through the bond, she sensed their readiness to trust her, to let her attempt something that had never been tried in their collective memory. "What do you need from us?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone speaking for the entire pack. "Space and silence," she replied, her attention turning inward to the growing warmth that seemed to respond to their trust. "And Cade needs to let me deeper into the bond. What I'm about to do requires access to the core connections that hold the pack together. That level of access," Dr. Blackwood began, then fell silent as multiple weapons shifted in her direction. "That level of access requires absolute trust," Marcus finished, his gold-flecked eyes studying Nyx with careful evaluation. "If you betray that trust, you won't survive long enough to regret it." "I understand," Nyx said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But understand this in return: if I fail, Cade dies anyway. And when the pack fractures without an alpha, Helena's employers will move in to claim this territory. You'll lose everything either way." The brutal honesty of her assessment settled over the clearing like snow, cold and undeniable. These people were facing extinction regardless of the choices they made, which paradoxically made the choice easier. When all roads led to destruction, the path that offered even slim hope became the obvious selection. Cade looked around the circle of faces, reading the emotions and intentions of people he'd protected and led for years. When his gaze returned to Nyx, she saw decision crystallizing in those silver depths. "Do it," he said simply. "Whatever you need, however deep you need to go, I trust you." The words hit her like physical impact, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. An alpha's trust wasn't given lightly, especially not to a stranger whose true nature remained largely mysterious. But through the bond connection, she felt the sincerity of his faith and the pack's grudging willingness to follow his lead. Closing her eyes, Nyx let her consciousness sink deeper into the warm power that lived in her chest. It responded eagerly to her attention, unfolding like a flower in sunlight, as genetic memories and inherited knowledge rose to the surface of her awareness. She could see the structure of the pack bond, like a vast web of silver light, with Cade at the center and every pack member connected through threads of shared emotion and experience. But the web was diseased, corrupted by the slow spread of silver poisoning that ate at the connections like acid. Where there should have been clean, bright lines of communication, she saw threads that flickered and sparked with contamination. The poison wasn't just attacking Cade's nervous system, it was slowly severing his ability to maintain the bonds that held the pack together. "I can see it," she whispered, her voice carrying across the clearing despite its softness. "The corruption is worse than we thought. Helena didn't just poison your body, she attacked the supernatural connections that make you an alpha." Through the bond, she felt the pack's collective horror as they processed the implications. Without those connections, Cade would become just another werewolf, powerful but isolated. The pack would fragment into individual wolves without the unifying presence that made them a community. But as Nick studied the damaged connections, she began to see possibilities that filled her with growing excitement. The corruption was extensive but not complete there. Were clean pathways she could use as bridges, healthy connections that could serve as foundations for rebuilding what had been damaged. "This is going to hurt," she warned, her consciousness beginning to merge more completely with the pack bond. The poison has to be drawn out through the connections themselves, and that means pulling contamination through every link in the network. "Do what you have to do," Cade said, though she felt his involuntary tension as her power began to interface more directly with his nervous system. What followed was unlike anything Nyx had ever experienced or imagined. Her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of her individual mind, spreading through the pack bond like healing light through a network of crystal caves. She felt the unique personality and emotional signature of every pack member, their fears and hopes and dreams all connected through their shared loyalty to their alpha. But she also felt the poison in excruciating detail, not just its physical presence, but its deliberate malevolence. Helena had crafted this corruption with surgical precision, designing it to attack the specific neurological pathways that enabled supernatural bonding. Every dose had been calculated to cause maximum damage while remaining undetectable through normal examination. Drawing the poison out required creating new pathways for its removal, channels that could carry contamination away from vital connections without damaging the bonds themselves. Nyx found herself becoming a living filter, pulling corruption through her own consciousness and neutralizing it with the inherited power that flowed through her bloodline. The process was agonizing on a level that transcended physical pain. She felt every spark of contamination as it passed through her consciousness, each fragment of poison carrying echoes of Helena's malicious intent. But with the pain came revelation, not just about the corruption she was removing, but about the deeper structure of the pack bond itself. These connections weren't just supernatural convenience or genetic accident. They were ancient technology, biological engineering that had evolved over thousands of years to create stable supernatural communities. The bonds allowed werewolves to function as something greater than the sum of their individual parts, sharing strength and knowledge and emotional support in ways that made survival possible in a hostile world. As she worked, drawing poison through pathways that burned like molten silver, Nyx began to understand why her bloodline had been created in the first place. Moon-touched healers weren't just medical practitioners, they were maintenance specialists for the supernatural infrastructure that held werewolf society together. They existed at the intersection of human and wolf consciousness, able to bridge both worlds without belonging fully to either. The revelation came with its own agony as inherited memories flooded her awareness. She saw flashes of her ancestors working in hidden communities, repairing bonds damaged by persecution and war, maintaining the delicate connections that kept packs functional across generations. She felt their pride in their work and their terror when human authorities discovered their abilities, hunting them as witches and demons until they were forced into hiding. Through the pack bond, she sensed the collective amazement of the Shadowmere wolves as they felt their connections clearing and strengthening. Years of gradual deterioration reversed in minutes as clean pathways replaced corrupted ones, restoring communication channels they hadn't realized they'd lost. But the healing process demanded everything she had to give. Each strand of poison she extracted required conscious effort and personal cost, and there were dozens of corrupted connections throughout the network. By the time she reached the deepest levels of contamination, the places where Helena's poison had attacked Cade's core alpha functions, Nyx felt herself approaching the limits of her endurance. "Almost done," she gasped, her physical voice barely audible, while her consciousness worked on levels that existed beyond normal speech. "But the last bit is wrapped around your primary alpha bond. Removing it might temporarily sever your connection to the pack." Through their joined awareness, she felt Cade's understanding and acceptance. Losing the alpha bond, even temporarily, would leave him vulnerable and isolated in ways no ordinary human could comprehend. But the alternative was slow death by poisoning, followed by the pack's inevitable destruction. "Do it," he said, and through the bond she felt his absolute trust despite the risks involved. The final extraction required precision that pushed her abilities to their absolute limits. The poison had wrapped itself around the core connection like a parasite, feeding off the alpha bond while slowly destroying it from within. Removing it meant temporarily severing the connection that defined Cade's very identity, leaving him isolated in his own consciousness while she worked. When the bond snapped, the psychic impact hit the entire pack like a physical blow. Nyx felt their collective anguish as their alpha disappeared from their awareness, leaving them rudderless and afraid in ways that went beyond rational fear. But she forced herself to ignore their distress, focusing entirely on the delicate work of extracting the last traces of Helena's poison from the damaged connection. The contamination came away in threads of psychic fire that burned through her consciousness like acid through flesh. Each strand carried not just poison, but memory images of Helena's recruitment by unknown enemies, her careful planning and patient implementation of the pack's destruction, her satisfaction as she watched Cade slowly deteriorate under her supposed care. But beneath the layers of corruption, Nyx found something that made her heart race with hope. The alpha bond itself was undamaged, just temporarily suppressed by the poison that had wrapped around it. Once the contamination was completely removed, the connection could be restored to full strength, potentially stronger than it had been before the poisoning began. With infinite care, she began the process of reconstruction, using her own power as a bridge to reconnect Cade to the pack network. The moment his consciousness rejoined the bond, the clearing erupted in howls of relief and joy as 30 voices welcomed their alpha home. But the celebration was short-lived as the true scope of Helena's betrayal became clear through their restored connections. The poison had been just the beginning. Surveillance equipment hidden throughout the territory, detailed maps of pack defenses, and communication logs with corporate entities that viewed the Shadowmere wolves as obstacles to Ka. Profitable development. "How long?" Cade asked, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of an alpha processing betrayal on multiple levels. The silver poison was gone, but the silver in his eyes had taken on the hard gleam of polished steel. 2 years of planning, 6 months of active poisoning, Nyx replied, her consciousness still partially merged with the pack bond as she monitored the healing connections. But the people who recruited her have been watching this territory for much longer. They know your numbers, your defenses, your patrol patterns. They've been preparing for a takeover. Through the bond, she felt the pack's collective rage building to dangerous levels. These people had spent months watching their alpha slowly deteriorate, preparing themselves for the possibility of his death, all while the person they trusted to heal him was systematically destroying him from within. The development consortium expects me to be completely incapacitated within the week, Helena said, her voice carrying defiant bitterness despite her circumstances. When I don't report in, they'll assume their plan has succeeded and move to the next phase. Which is? Marcus demanded, his beta authority lending weight to the question. Armed occupation of the territory under the pretense of environmental protection, she replied with malicious satisfaction. They've prepared documentation claiming this area contains endangered species that require federal oversight. Once they establish a presence, they'll gradually expand their control until the pack is forced to relocate. The plan was elegantly vicious in its sophistication. Rather than direct confrontation with supernatural beings who could tear armed humans apart with their bare hands, Helena's employers had chosen slow corruption from within, followed by legal manipulation that would force the pack to abandon their ancestral home. Except now, their inside agent has been exposed and their timeline has been destroyed, Nyx pointed out, feeling grim satisfaction as she sensed Helena's growing alarm. They're expecting a pack crippled by their alpha's madness, not a fully functional community with restored bonds and advance warning of their plans. We need to move fast, Cade said, his alpha authority reasserting itself as his mind cleared for the first time in months. If they're expecting Helena's signal within the week, we have days to prepare for their arrival. Or we could take the fight to them, suggested a new voice from the crowd, this one belonging to a woman whose scarred hands spoke of recent violence. Hunt down the people who tried to destroy us before they have a chance to implement their backup plans. The suggestion sent electric anticipation through the pack bond, and Nyx felt their collective hunger for revenge like a physical force. These people had been pushed to the edge of extinction by enemies who hid behind corporate structures and legal manipulations. Given the chance, they would tear their would-be destroyers apart with supernatural efficiency. But as she monitored the pack's emotional temperature, Nyx sensed something that worried her. The restored bonds were stronger than ever, but they were also carrying currents of rage and bloodlust that could easily spiral beyond control. The healing process had removed more than just poisoning, had also stripped away months of accumulated emotional numbness, leaving raw feelings that demanded outlet. There's something else we need to consider, she said, her voice cutting through the rising tide of violent planning. The healing process has restored your connections, but it's also amplified your emotional responses. You're all feeling things more intensely than you have in months. Is that a problem? Cade asked, though his tone suggested he was already beginning to sense the answer. It could be, she admitted, her consciousness still partially merged with the pack bond as she monitored the emotional currents flowing between them. Right now, you're unified by shared anger and the desire for revenge. But those same amplified emotions could turn destructive if they're not carefully managed. Through the bond, she felt their understanding and reluctant acceptance of her warning. The pack's restored strength came with restored vulnerabilities, emotions that had been suppressed by months of gradual poisoning were now flowing freely through connections that carried them to every member of the community. "What do you recommend?" Marcus asked, his beta training helping him recognize the potential for disaster in their current emotional state. "Focus on defense first, revenge second," Nyx replied, though she could feel the pack's resistance to the suggestion. "Use the anger to strengthen your territory rather than hunt your enemies. Make this place so well defended that Helena's employers will think twice about their occupation plans." "And if they come anyway?" asked the scarred woman, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lost too much to count. "Then you'll be ready for them," Nyx said simply. "But you'll be responding to direct threat rather than hunting based on anticipation. There's a legal and moral difference that could matter if this situation escalates to involve human authorities." The practical wisdom of her advice was undeniable, even if it ran counter to their instinctive desire for immediate action. Through the pack bond, she felt them gradually accepting the necessity of patience, preparation over impulsive revenge. "She's right," Cade said finally, his alpha authority helping to settle the emotional turbulence flowing through the connections. "We fortify the territory and prepare for siege. If they want to try taking our home, they'll discover exactly what kind of resistance a unified pack can provide." As the pack began to disperse to implement defensive preparations, Nyx felt her consciousness gradually separating from the bond network. The healing work was complete, and maintaining the deep connection was exhausting in ways she was only beginning to understand. But as she pulled back into her individual awareness, she realized that the bond hadn't released her entirely, thin threads of TEDs. Connection remained, linking her to the pack in ways that felt permanent and profound. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She had become part of the supernatural community she'd helped to heal. "The connection is permanent, isn't it?" Cade observed, his silver eyes studying her with new understanding. "You're not just a healer who happened to help us. You're pack now." The words hit her like revelation. Though part of her had already suspected the truth, the healing process had required such deep integration with the pack bond that complete separation was impossible. She had traded her human isolation for Thaka, supernatural belonging, gaining a family at the cost of her former independence. "I felt it happening during the healing," she admitted, her hand still tingling from their earlier contact. "My ancestors were never meant to work alone. They were integrated into the communities they served, becoming permanent bridges between human and werewolf consciousness." "How do you feel about that?" Marcus asked, his gold-flecked eyes sympathetic to the enormity of the change she'd undergone. Nyx considered the question seriously, examining her emotional response to the permanent alteration of her fundamental nature. The human life she'd left behind seemed distant and unsatisfying compared to the rich connections now flowing through her awareness. She had spent years feeling isolated and purposeless, following dreams she couldn't understand toward a destination she couldn't name. Now she understood that the dreams had been calling her home to a community she'd never known she needed. "It feels right," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The pack's collective approval flowed through the bond like warm sunlight, welcoming her into their family with an acceptance she'd never experienced in the human world. But beneath their joy, she sensed currents of concern about the challenges that lay ahead. Helena's employers wouldn't simply abandon their plans because they're inside. Agent had been exposed. Corporate entities that invested years in territorial acquisition didn't retreat at the first sign of resistance. If anything, the failure of their subtle approach would likely trigger more direct and dangerous alternatives. "We need to know more about who we're really fighting," Nix said, her enhanced awareness already beginning to process tactical considerations. Helena mentioned a development consortium, but that's probably just the public face of the operation. The real decision-makers are likely hidden behind multiple layers of corporate structure. "I might be able to help with that," said a new voice from the edge of the clearing. Everyone turned to see a young man emerging from the forest, his clothes marked by travel and his expression carrying urgent concern. "My name is Daniel Morrison, and I've been tracking the same people who recruited Dr. Blackwood." The pack's reaction was immediate and defensive, weapons appearing as they surrounded the newcomer with supernatural speed. But Nix felt something through her connection to the bond. This man carried no malicious intent, only desperate hope and exhausted determination. "He's not a threat," she said, her voice carrying enough authority to pause the pack's aggressive response. "He's been hunting Helena's employers for personal reasons." Daniel nodded gratefully at her intervention, his eyes reflecting relief at finding potential allies. "My sister worked for Meridian Development Corp as an environmental specialist. When she discovered their real plans for this territory, they killed her and made it look like an accident." The words sent electric tension through the pack bond as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Meridian Development Corporation wasn't just another real estate company. They were part of a network of entities that specialized in acquiring supernatural territories through legal manipulation and targeted violence. "How many communities have they destroyed?" Cade asked, his alpha instincts recognizing the scope of the threat they were facing. "At least 12 that I've been able to document," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief and anger. "They target isolated supernatural communities, corrupt them from within, then use legal mechanisms to force relocation. The Shadowmere Pack is just their latest acquisition project." Through the pack bond, Nix felt their collective horror as they processed the implications. They weren't facing a single corporate entity interested in their specific territory. They were confronting a systematic campaign of supernatural genocide disguised as legitimate business development. "But why?" Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "What do they really want with our territories?" "Control," Daniel said simply. "Supernatural communities represent the last truly independent societies in North America. They operate outside government oversight, maintain their own laws and customs, and control resources that corporations can't access through normal channels. Destroying them eliminates competition and opens up territories for unrestricted development." The brutal logic of the plan was undeniable, and Nix felt the pack's growing determination to resist flowing through their restored connections. These people had built something precious in their mountain sanctuary, a community that balanced ancient traditions with modern palm necessities, creating a sustainable way of life, but honored both their supernatural nature and their environmental responsibilities. "They picked the wrong pack to target," said the scarred woman, her voice carrying deadly promise. "We're not some isolated group of wolves trying to hide from the modern world. We're a functioning community with resources and connections of our own." "And now we have advance warning of their plans," Cade added, his silver eyes gleaming with strategic calculation. Helena expected to deliver a crippled pack ready for easy conquest. Instead, they'll find a unified community prepared for war. As the pack began discussing defensive strategies and tactical preparations, Nyx found herself studying Helena Blackwood with new understanding. The woman who'd nearly destroyed them wasn't just a traitor. She was a victim of the same systematic corruption that had targeted dozens of other communities. Somewhere in her past, Meridian Development had found leverage to turn her against her adopted family, using her medical knowledge and pack position to implement their subtle destruction. "Helena," she said, interrupting the planning discussions with quiet authority, "how did they recruit you? What did they offer that was worth betraying people who trusted you with their lives?" The question hit its target with devastating accuracy. Helena's defiant mask cracked, revealing glimpses of pain and regret that suggested her betrayal hadn't come easily. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated shame and desperate justification. "My daughter," she whispered, the words barely audible in the mountain air. "They have my daughter. Sarah went missing 3 years ago during a research trip to study wolf populations in Alaska. The police gave up after 6 months, but Meridian contacted me with proof that she was alive. They said they'd return her safely if I helped them acquire this territory." The revelation hit the pack like a physical blow, reframing Helena's betrayal in terms they could understand even if they couldn't forgive. Through the bond, Nyx felt their anger shifting from pure rage to something more complex fury at the people who'd manipulated Helena's maternal love, mixed with sympathy for the impossible choice she'd been forced to make. 3 years, Marcus said quietly, his beta training helping him process the tactical implications. "Long enough to plan this operation in detail, to study our defenses and identify our vulnerabilities. They've been preparing for this moment since they took her daughter. And they'll kill Sarah the moment they realize their plan has failed," Helena added, her voice breaking as she spoke the truth they'd all already recognized. "She's only alive as long as I'm useful to them." "Now that you've exposed me," the unfinished sentence hung in the air like a death knell, and Nyx felt the pack's struggle between justice and mercy flowing through their connections. Helena had nearly destroyed their community, poisoning their alpha and preparing them for conquest by ruthless enemies. But she'd done it to save her child, driven by the same fierce protectiveness that motivated every parent in the pack. "Where are they holding her?" Cade asked, his alpha authority cutting through the emotional turbulence with practical necessity. "I don't know," Helena admitted, tears finally breaking through her controlled facade. All communication was handled through encrypted messages and dead drops. "I was given minimal information to prevent exactly this kind of exposure." "But you must have some idea," Daniel pressed, his personal investment in stopping Meridian adding urgency to his voice. "Location clues, timing references, anything that might help us find her." Helena's face twisted with concentration as she searched her memory for useful details. The messages always came through a routing system based in Seattle, but that could mean anything. The only specific reference was something about northern facilities, but I assumed that meant somewhere in Alaska, where she was originally taken. Or it could mean Northern California, Northern Oregon, Northern Idaho, Marcus pointed out, his tactical mind processing the limited information. They could be holding her anywhere within a 1,000-mile radius. The scope of the potential search area was daunting. But Nyx felt something stirring in her consciousness, an awareness that came from her deepened connection to the pack bond and the inherited knowledge flowing through her bloodline. Moon-touched healers hadn't just repaired supernatural connections. They'd also served as bridges between communities, maintaining networks of communication that spanned entire continents. "I might be able to help," she said, her voice carrying new confidence as genetic memories provided unexpected insights. The healing abilities come with enhanced sensitivity to supernatural connections. If Sarah has any werewolf heritage at all, I might be able to sense her location through the broader network. "She's human," Helena said quickly, then paused as understanding dawned in her storm-cloud eyes. But her father was from the Midnight Creek Pack in northern Montana. He died when she was young, before her werewolf traits manifested. "Then she carries the genetic markers even if she hasn't transformed," Nick said, excitement building as possibilities crystallized in her mind. Dormant werewolf DNA still responds to pack bonds and supernatural connections. If I can access the broader network of North American packs. The idea was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. Individual pack bonds were complex enough. Attempting to connect with multiple communities across thousands of miles would require abilities that existed more in legend than documented reality. But as Nyx reached out with her enhanced consciousness, she began to sense something that filled her with growing amazement. The pack bonds weren't isolated. Networks, they were connected to each packer, other through channels so subtle that only specialized awareness could detect them, like a vast web of silver light spanning the continent. Supernatural communities maintained contact through connections that existed below the threshold of normal perception. "I can feel them," she whispered, her awareness expanding beyond the Shadowmere territory to touch dozens of other pack bonds scattered across the western United States. "There are so many communities, all connected through pathways I never imagined existed." Through these expanded connections, she began searching for the specific resonance that would mark Helena's daughter. Dormant werewolf genetics carried their own signature, distinct from both human and fully manifested supernatural consciousness. Finding Sarah would require sorting through thousands of individual signatures until she located the one that matched Helena's maternal bond. The search was exhausting and overwhelming, like trying to find a specific star in a sky full of galaxies. But her enhanced abilities proved equal to the challenge, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she found what she was looking for. "Northern Washington," she said, her voice tight with concentration as she maintained the delicate connection. "There's a facility near the Canadian border, hidden in old-growth forest. She's alive, but she's not alone. There are others people taken from various supernatural communities over the past several years." The revelation sent shockwaves through the pack bond as they processed the implications. Meridian development wasn't just destroying supernatural communities, they were harvesting people from them, creating some kind of collection that served purposes beyond simple territorial acquisition. "A breeding program," Daniel said, his voice carrying sick understanding. "My research into other missing persons cases suggested they were collecting individuals with specific genetic traits. If they're planning to create their own supernatural workforce." The possibility was too horrific to fully contemplate, but it explained the systematic nature of Meridian's operations. Rather than simply destroying supernatural communities, they were harvesting the unique abilities and genetic advantages that made werewolf society possible. "We have to get them out," Helena said, her maternal desperation overriding her earlier defiance. Not just Sarah, but all of them. If what you're sensing is correct, there could be dozens of people held in that facility. A rescue operation against a heavily fortified corporate facility would require resources we don't have, Marcus pointed out, though his tone suggested he was already considering tactical possibilities. Even with our supernatural advantages, we'd be outnumbered and outgunned by professional security forces. Not if we work with other packs, Cade said, his alpha mind processing the strategic implications of Nyx's expanded awareness. If Meridian has been targeting communities across the region, we're not the only ones with reasons to want them stopped. The idea of coordinating multiple supernatural communities for a joint operation was unprecedented in recent history, but the scope of the threat demanded equally unprecedented responses. Through her enhanced connection to the broader network, Nyx could sense the growing awareness among other packs that they faced a common enemy requiring unified resistance. I can maintain communication with the other communities, she offered, her consciousness still partially extended through the supernatural network. Coordinate planning and share intelligence in real time. How many packs would be willing to work together? Daniel asked, his tacticum experience helping him evaluate the feasibility of a multi-community operation. At least 8 that I can sense directly. Nyx replied, her awareness scanning the network for signs of willingness to cooperate. But there are others, more distant communities that might join if they understand the scope of the threat. The possibilities were intoxicating, but Cade's alpha training kept him focused on practical realities. Coordinating that many independent communities would be like herding cats, each with their own customs and territorial concerns. We'd need a clear command structure and shared objectives. The shared objective is survival, Helena said, her voice carrying the desperate authority of someone who'd seen the enemy's true capabilities. Meridian isn't just targeting individual communities there, trying to destroy supernatural society entirely. Every pack that stands alone will eventually fall. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and through the pack, Bond Nyx felt the Shadowmere wolves' growing commitment to the larger struggle. They had been given advance warning and unprecedented abilities to coordinate resistance. The question was whether they could overcome generations of pack independence to create an effective alliance. We'll need proof, Marcus said, his beta pragmatism cutting through romantic visions of supernatural unity. Other alphas won't commit their people to a joint operation based on our word alone. They'll want evidence of the threat and clear tactical advantages. I have documentation, Daniel offered, pulling a waterproof bag from his backpack. 3 years of research into Meridian's operations, including financial records, personnel files, and communication intercepts. It's enough to prove the scope of their activities. And I can provide direct access to their internal planning, Helena added reluctantly. My communication protocols are still active. They don't know I've been exposed yet. The combination of evidence and inside access created possibilities that hadn't existed an hour earlier. But as the pack began detailed planning for what would essentially be a war against corporate enemies, Nyx felt something troubling through her expanded awareness. Other supernatural communities were already under attack. The facility holding Sarah and the other captives was just one part of a coordinated offensive that was unfolding across the entire western United States. While the Shadowmere pack had been dealing with Helena's slow poisoning, Meridian had been implementing similar operations against dozens of other communities. We're running out of time, she announced, her voice cutting through the planning discussions with urgent authority. The attacks aren't future plans. They're happening now. I can sense communities under siege, others that have already fallen. Meridian is implementing a coordinated strike designed to destroy supernatural society in a matter of weeks. The revelation galvanized the pack into immediate action, their restored bonds carrying currents of determination that transcended individual fear. They had perhaps days to organize a resistance that could save not just the captives in the northern facility, but the entire network of supernatural communities that Meridian had targeted for destruction. Then we move fast and we move together, Cade declared, his alpha authority settling over the clearing like a comforting weight. Nyx, can you establish communication with the other packs immediately? Already working on it, she replied, her consciousness reaching out through channels that sparkled with silver fire. I'm sending preliminary warnings and asking for emergency council representatives. Helena, you're going to send a message to your Meridian contacts, Marcus added, his tactical mind organizing the Palmer. Multiple aspects of their operation. Something that keeps them thinking their plan is proceeding normally while we prepare our counterstrike. And, Daniel, we need every piece of intelligence you've gathered, organized for rapid distribution. Cade continued, delegating responsibilities with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex operations under pressure. As the pack dispersed to implement their emergency preparations, Nyx found herself standing alone with Cade in the center of the clearing. The restored bond between them hummed with shared purpose and growing attraction that neither of them had time to fully explore. "Thank you," he said simply, his silver eyes holding depths of gratitude that words couldn't convey. "For everything, the healing, the warnings, the connections to other communities. You've given us a chance at survival." "We've given each other a chance," she corrected, feeling the permanent connections that now bound her to this community and its alpha. "I'm not a visitor anymore, Cade. This is my pack, my family, my home, and I'll fight for it just as hard as anyone else." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and she saw understanding dawn in his silver gaze. The healing process had created more than restored pack bonds. It had forged connections between them that went deeper than alpha and pack member, touching possibilities that could only be explored once the immediate crisis was resolved. "When this is over," he said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, "we need to talk about what these new connections mean." "When this is over," she agreed, feeling her pulse quicken at his proximity, "we'll have time to explore a lot of things." The promise hung between them like silver fire, adding personal stakes to their fight against Meridian's systematic destruction. They weren't just defending territory or community, were protecting the possibility of a future that included whatever was growing between them. But as voices began calling them back to urgent preparations, they separated reluctantly, both understanding that survival had to come before romance. The next few days would determine whether supernatural society continued to exist, or whether Meridian's corporate genocide would succeed in destroying communities that had thrived for thousands of years. The war for the future of werewolf society was about to begin, and the Shadowmere Pack would stand at the center of a conflict that would reshape the supernatural world forever. But they would not stand alone through Nyx's enhanced abilities. They were connected to allies they'd never known existed, united by bonds that transcended territory and tradition. The Alpha had thought she was a witch come to destroy them. Instead, she had become the bridge that would allow their entire society to survive. The emergency council convened at midnight in the central lodge, with representatives from 7 different packs gathering through a combination of physical presence and supernatural connection. Nyx sat at the heart of an intricate circle of communication, her consciousness extended through multiple pack bonds simultaneously as she facilitated discussions between alphas who had never spoken directly con before. To her left sat Victoria Redmoon of the Cascade Pack, a fierce woman with prematurely grey hair and eyes like winter storms. Her territory bordered the Shadowmere lands, and she'd been fighting increasing corporate pressure for the past 2 years. Through the bond connection, Nyx felt her desperate relief at finally finding allies who understood the scope of the threat. Across from Victoria, the massive frame of Alpha Thomas Ironwood dominated his chair, his presence radiating the kind of authority that came from protecting the Glacier Peak Pack through decades of human encroachment. His weathered hands bore scars from battles fought with both claws and legal documents, and his voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "Meridian hit us 3 months ago," he rumbled, his words carrying through both spoken language and the supernatural network Nyx maintained. "Lost 6 pack members before we understood what we were really fighting. They didn't just want our territory, they wanted our people." Through the expanded bond, she felt the echo of his pain and rage, emotions shared by representatives from the Olympic Peninsula Pack, the Rainier Collective, and the smaller communities that had somehow survived Meridian's power. Initial assaults. Each alpha carried stories of loss and betrayal, of trusted members who'd been corrupted or simply disappeared without trace. "The pattern is consistent across all targeted territories," Daniel Morrison said, his laptop open as he shared intelligence gathered through 3 years of obsessive investigation. "They identify isolated supernatural communities, study their social structures for months or years, then implement targeted corruption campaigns designed to weaken resistance before direct assault. Helena's poisoning of our alpha was just one example," Marcus added, his beta training helping him analyze the tactical implications. "Other communities face different approaches: financial pressure, legal harassment, environmental sabotage, whatever it took to make them vulnerable." Alpha Sarah Nightwind of the Coastal Pack leaned forward, her sea-green eyes reflecting the kind of fury that came from watching helpless communities destroyed by forces they couldn't fight through traditional means. "They tried to buy us out first, offered more money than most of us had ever seen. When that failed, they started targeting our fishing boats with regulatory harassment. By the time we understood the real threat, they'd already taken 4 of our young adults." The stories continued around the circle, each one adding pieces to a puzzle that revealed Meridian's systematic approach to supernatural genocide. They weren't just another corporation seeking profitable development, they were implementing a coordinated campaign designed to destroy an entire way of life. But as the alphas shared their experiences, Nyx began sensing something else through the expanded bond network. The communities that had survived Meridian's initial attacks shared certain characteristics: strong internal unity, diversified resources, and most importantly, leaders who'd been willing to adapt traditional pack structures to modern threats. "You've all survived because you evolved," she said, her voice cutting through the grim recounting of losses. "The communities that fell were the ones that tried to hide from the modern world, that refused to acknowledge how much had changed. You adapted, and that's why you're still here to fight back." Adaptation only goes so far when you're facing enemies with unlimited resources and legal authority, Victoria pointed out, though her tone carried grudging acknowledgement of the truth. We need more than just evolution, we need revolution. Which is exactly what we're proposing, Cade said, his alpha presence filling the lodge with quiet authority. Not just survival, but active resistance. A coordinated campaign to destroy Meridian's operations and rescue the people they've taken. The proposal sent electric anticipation through the gathered representatives, but also currents of fear and uncertainty. What they were discussing went far beyond traditional pack warfare. It meant confronting corporate entities backed by federal authority, fighting battles that could expose supernatural society to broader human awareness. The risks are enormous, Alpha Marcus Stormclaw of the Northern Border Pack said through the connection, his consciousness reaching them from his territory near the Canadian frontier. If we fail, if we're exposed, every supernatural community in North America becomes a target for government intervention. We're already targets, Thomas Ironwood replied, his scarred hands clenched into fists. The only question is whether we die hiding or die fighting. Through the bond network, Nix felt the collective struggle as 7 different communities weighed survival against resistance, traditional secrecy against desperate action. These people had spent generations avoiding human attention, building sustainable lives in remote territories where they could maintain their customs without interference. But those same customs and territories had made them vulnerable to systematic targeting by enemies who understood their patterns and exploited their isolation. The choice they faced was brutal in its simplicity: abandon everything that made them who they were, or risk everything to preserve it. There might be a third option, she said, her enhanced awareness picking up possibilities that existed beyond the immediate binary. What if we could expose Meridian's operations without exposing ourselves? Turn their own methods against them? How? Victoria asked, though her storm-coloured eyes suggested she was already beginning to see the potential. Meridian has been operating in legal grey areas, using regulatory manipulation and corporate shell companies to hide their real activities, Daniel explained, his intelligence background helping him process the tactical possibilities. If we could gather enough evidence of their illegal activities, kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, we could destroy them through the same legal system they've been using against you. But that requires getting inside their operations, Marcus pointed out, his beta training identifying the operational challenges. Gathering evidence that would stand up in human courts while avoiding exposure of our own supernatural nature. I can help with that, Helena said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of desperate hope. My communication protocols are still active. They don't know I've been exposed yet. I could feed them false information while gathering intelligence about their broader operations. The offer sent complex currents through the pack bonds as the assembled alphas weighed trust against necessity. Helena had nearly destroyed the Shadowmere pack through her betrayal, but her continued access to Meridian's communication networks made her invaluable for intelligence gathering. It's a risk, Cade acknowledged, his silver eyes studying Helena with careful evaluation. If they discover the deception, they'll kill your daughter and accelerate their timeline for other operations. Sarah is dead anyway if we don't stop them, Helena replied, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. At least this way, her death might serve a purpose beyond corporate profit. The stark honesty of her assessment settled over the lodge like snow, cold and undeniable. Through the bond network, Nix felt the collective acknowledgement that they were all facing similar calculations. The people they loved were already lost unless they could successfully challenge an enemy with vastly superior resources. Then we move on multiple fronts simultaneously, Alpha Victoria said, her tactical mind organizing the complex operation they were contemplating. Intelligence gathering, evidence collection, direct rescue operations, and legal warfare, all coordinated through the bond network. Can you maintain that level of connection across such distances? Thomas asked, his weathered face turning toward Nix with something approaching awe. What you're describing would require communication capabilities that exist more in legend than documented reality. The capabilities exist, she replied, her consciousness already reaching out to test the limits of her enhanced awareness. My bloodline was designed specifically for this kind of coordination. The question is whether the communities are willing to trust each other enough to make it work. The challenge she posed went to the heart of werewolf society's fundamental structure. Packs were independent by nature, led by alphas, whose authority couldn't be questioned without triggering potentially fatal dominance conflicts. Creating effective cooperation between multiple communities required them to temporarily subordinate individual pack interests to larger strategic necessities. We'll need clear command protocols, Alpha Marcus said through the Northern Connection, his military background helping him identify potential sources of conflict. 7 different alphas trying to coordinate combat operations is a recipe for disaster unless we establish unified leadership. I propose a rotating command structure, Cade said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Different alphas take operational control based on their specific expertise and territorial advantages. Thomas leads mountain operations, Victoria handles intelligence coordination, Sarah manages coastal insertions. The proposal was elegant in its recognition of individual strengths while maintaining collective unity, but it also required unprecedented trust between communities that had maintained independence generations. Through the bond network, Nix felt their struggle with concepts that challenged everything they'd been taught about pack hierarchy and territorial sovereignty. There's precedent for this kind of cooperation, she said, accessing genetic memories that stretched back centuries. During the European persecution period, multiple communities coordinated resistance through bond networks maintained by moon-touched healers. They called it the Silver Web, a communication system that allowed supernatural societies to survive systematic attempts at extermination. But that was hundreds of years ago, Victoria pointed out, though her tone carried more curiosity than skepticism. The world has changed dramatically since then. The threats have evolved, but the basic principles remain the same, Nix replied, her consciousness touching historical patterns that echoed through the expanded network. Enemies who seek to destroy supernatural society through systematic isolation and corruption. The only effective response is unified resistance that transcends individual territorial concerns. As the assembled alphas absorbed the historical perspective, she felt their collective understanding shifting from desperate improvisation to purposeful strategy. They weren't just making up new approaches to unprecedented problems, they were reviving ancient techniques that had proven effective against similar threats in the past. The Silver Web, Alpha Sarah repeated, her sea-green eyes reflecting growing excitement. If we could recreate something like that, we'd have communication advantages that Meridian can't match or intercept. More than just communication, Daniel added, his analytical mind processing the implications. real-time intelligence sharing, coordinated tactical responses, early warning systems for future attacks. It could revolutionize how supernatural communities defend themselves. The possibilities were intoxicating, but they also carried enormous risks. Creating a permanent communication network between multiple packs would fundamentally alter the nature of werewolf society, potentially concentrating power in ways that could prove dangerous if the wrong people gained control. "We're talking about changing everything," Thomas observed, his scarred hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were considering. "Not just fighting Meridian, but restructuring how our people relate to each other and the world around us." "Everything is already changing," Cade replied, his alpha authority cutting through uncertainty with Kra. "Practical reality. Meridian has forced our hand. We can evolve, or we can die, but we can't stay the same." Through the bond network, Nyx felt the collective moment of decision as 7 different communities chose their future. The vote wasn't formal or ceremonial, it was a shared emotional commitment that flowed through supernatural connections too deep for ordinary language. They would fight, not just for survival, but for the right to determine their own evolution, rather than having change imposed through corporate genocide. The silver web would rise again, linking communities across thousands of miles through bonds that no human technology could detect or disrupt. "Then let's begin," Victoria said, her storm-coloured eyes reflecting the dangerous gleam of someone committed to desperate action. "Helena, what's your next scheduled communication with Meridian?" "Tomorrow morning," Helena replied, checking the encrypted phone that represented her lifeline to her daughter. "They're expecting a progress report on Cade's deterioration and timeline estimates for pack fragmentation." "Perfect," Marcus said, his beta training helping him organize the deception campaign they were implementing. "You'll report that the poisoning has accelerated beyond expectations. The Alpha is experiencing complete psychotic breaks, and the pack is discussing emergency succession protocols. That should buy us at least a week before they expect to move to direct occupation," Daniel added, his intelligence analysis helping predict Meridian's likely responses. "Time to coordinate the other aspects of our operation." As the planning session continued deep into the night, Nyx found herself marveling at the transformation she'd witnessed. 12 hours earlier, these communities had been isolated and vulnerable, facing destruction through systematic corruption campaigns they couldn't effectively resist. Now, they were becoming something unprecedented. In modern supernatural history, a unified alliance, capable of coordinating resistance across continental distances. The moon-touched bloodline that had driven her to this mountain clearing was fulfilling its ancient purpose, serving as the bridge that allowed independent communities to become something greater than the sum of their individual parts. But as dawn approached and the emergency council prepared to disperse, she felt something troubling through the expanded network. The facility holding Helena's daughter and the other captives wasn't just a prison. It was a research center where Meridian's scientists were conducting experiments designed to understand and replicate supernatural abilities. "There's something else," she announced, her voice cutting through the tactical discussions with urgent authority. "The people they've taken aren't just hostages, they're test subjects. Meridian is trying to create artificial werewolves, super soldiers with supernatural abilities, but without the social bonds that make packs possible." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled representatives as they processed implications that went far beyond territorial acquisition. If Meridian succeeded in their research, They could create armies of artificial werewolves, loyal only to corporate interests, beings with supernatural power, but without the ethical constraints that governed natural behavior. That changes everything, Alpha Thomas said, his weathered face grim with understanding. We're not just fighting for our territories, we're fighting to prevent the militarization of our entire species. How long do we have before their research produces viable results? Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would be terrifying. Based on the files I've been able to access, they're very close to breakthrough, Daniel replied, his laptop screen reflecting data that made him pale with horror. Maybe weeks, possibly days. They've been working on this project for years, using genetic material harvested from communities they've destroyed. The timeline compressed around them like a noose, transforming their careful planning into desperate improvisation. They had days to coordinate a rescue operation that would normally require months of preparation, while simultaneously gathering evidence that could destroy Meridian through legal channels. We'll have to divide our resources, Cade decided, his alpha authority settling the question of priorities. Some teams focus on the immediate rescue, others work on the broader intelligence operation. Nix coordinates between all groups through the silver web. I can handle the communication load, she confirmed, though privately she wondered if her enhanced abilities were truly equal to the challenge they were contemplating. But remember that I'm still learning these capabilities. If the network becomes too complex or the distances too great, then we adapt and overcome, Marcus said simply, his beta confidence providing emotional anchor for the entire group. We've already accomplished things that were supposed to be impossible. A few more miracles shouldn't be too much to ask. The words carried more hope than certainty, but they also reflected the transformation that had occurred over the past few hours. These people had moved beyond fear and resignation to something approaching supernatural optimism, the belief that unified action could overcome any obstacle, no matter how overwhelming it initially appeared. As the representatives prepared to return to their communities, Nix felt the silver web taking shape around them, like a constellation of silver fire. Individual pack bonds remained intact and independent, but they were now connected through channels that allowed instant communication and coordinated response to shared threats. For the first time in centuries, supernatural society had the tools it needed to defend itself against systematic persecution. Whether those tools would prove sufficient against corporate enemies backed by unlimited resources remained to be seen, but the alternative to fighting was certain extinction. The war for the future of werewolf society was about to begin in earnest, and the outcome would determine whether supernatural communities could evolve to meet modern challenges or would be destroyed by their inability to adapt to a changing world. But as the Emergency Council disbanded and participants prepared for the desperate operations ahead, one thing had become crystal clear. The alpha of the Shadowmere pack no longer thought Nyx was a witch sent to curse them. She had become something far more powerful and dangerous. The catalyst that would either save supernatural society or witness its final destruction in the fires of open